My name is Padma Kaimal, and I am married to Andy Roddick.
Namaste, morning.
म विशाल भट्टराई
Namaste, my name is Koshish Basala. I am currently an undergraduate student studying history at Harvard College.
नमस्ते सबैजना म रोशन यादव
नमस्ते सबैजनालाई म किरण पौडेल
नमस्ते म प्रणव खरेल
म देवेन्द्र रुप्पी
म सञ्जिला मुक्तान
म रुख कुन्नी
आजको स्पिकर चाहिँ एन्ड्रु रटर हि इज चार्ल्स ए डाना प्रोफेसर अफ हिस्ट्री एमेरिटस एट Colgate University, New York, USA. He is a specialist in the history of US foreign relations. His most recent book is Empires of the Senses, Bodily Encounters in Imperial India and the Philippines. He is also the past president of the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Ramesh. And thank you all for coming. I'm sorry that Patush couldn't be here today, but I very much appreciate the invitation to speak at Martin Chautari. I was unable to put an outline of my talk as I intended to do on the board behind me. It confounded us, all of us. I kind of stood to the side and none of us could figure it out. So let me just briefly tell you the order of things today, how I'm going to try to proceed, and if you can remember, fine. If not, I'll try to make it clear as I go along where I am in an outline. The title of my talk is Odor and Empire, Smell and Civilization in Imperial India and the Philippines. I think that's what's written on the announcement, so you should have that. I'd first like to offer a brief intellectual autobiography, that is, that will tell you about how I came to do this kind of work. In the outline, I had cleverly titled that Coming to My Senses, so for what that's worth. Then I'd like to offer 4 propositions about doing this kind of history, the history of the 5 human senses. So I'm still setting the stage here. This is still context. And then I'll come to cases and talk about the odors of empire in India and the Philippines, and then end with kind of a rocking conclusion of the whole thing. Odor and civilization and the end of empire. So the last point, odor and civilization, keyword, and the end of empire. So the autobiography part, I was trained as a historian of US foreign relations. My interest originally was in ideology as an explanation for US policy in the world. Ideology was then understood, and by then I mean about the 1970s, which is when I was an undergraduate and then a graduate student, as having roots in a Marxist understanding of history. Therefore, it had a materialist basis. Ideology, as some of you will know, has kind of a long genealogy in literature from Hegel to Marx, Gramsci. Generally, it's associated with the left, and generally, as I say, with a kind of material interpretation of US foreign relations. Anyway, this is how I was trained. This is how I came to be a historian methodologically. This is the perspective that guided my first book, my doctoral dissertation, and then my book, which was a study of early US involvement in the Vietnam War. Even before it was a war in the 1940s and 1950s, it was an intervention. It was a conflict that drew the United States in, and the perspective I took in that book was an ideological one, or a political economic one. Again, a kind of materialist view of how the United States got itself into the mess of Vietnam. That also, I should add, shaped the syllabus as I wrote when I taught. So I started teaching in the 1980s, guess the end of the 70s really, and the syllabus as I wrote in the history of US foreign relations took this same perspective. I talked to my students a lot about ideology. Then things changed, and they changed when I spent 9 months in India in the mid-1980s, helping Padma, my wife, we were newly married, with her field work on Hindu temple architecture in southern India, in Tamil Nadu. Now, I had come along mostly to assist her, to carry camera bags, to take notes, to try as best I could to stay out of the way of the work she was doing. But I also had it in mind to start a new book on US relations with India. There wasn't much in the literature of US foreign relations on this, and I wanted to do something about US-India relations during the prime ministry of Jawaharlal Nehru, so from Indian independence in 1947 until Nehru's death in 1964. I started like any foreign relations historian would start. We had some time in New Delhi. I went to the archives. That's what one did. That's what one does. I went to the National Archives of India. That wasn't terribly useful. But I went to the Nehru Library, the Murthy House, as it's called, and that was much better. There was some material available then, as early as 1984, that was very helpful to me as I started to think about this topic. But most of what I learned about India, I didn't learn from the archive. I learned instead by meeting people. As I went with Padma on her research. We went into the field, I met people there. We took an apartment in what was then called Madras. I met our neighbors, our landlord, people on the street, drivers. In other words, I really experienced India before I learned about its foreign policy history or its relations with the United States, which is a kind of a top-down way of going about US foreign relations. It was not the kind of thing people in my field tended to do. But it got me thinking that archival research was not the be-all and end-all of learning about encounters, now framed broadly, between people and nations. The result was that I shifted away from ideology, from a materialist view of US foreign relations, to a broadly cultural approach. I was inspired less now by Marx and the great US foreign relations historian William Appleman Williams, a name some of you may know, most of you probably not, but by Clifford Geertz, who was a cultural anthropologist and whose ideas about culture had already started to influence the discipline of history, especially social history, cultural history, intellectual history. Not my sub-discipline, not US foreign relations. I didn't know many people in my subset of historians who read Geertz or cared much about him or thought that his insights could be applied to the history of US foreign relations. But if you think more broadly about encounter, rather than say what one diplomat said to another or wrote to another, then you began to get an idea of how this cultural Geertzian approach might be interesting to work with. So eventually I wrote this book. It was called Comrades at Odds. It's about US-India relations. And instead of having the kinds of chapters that my first book had, one chapter about political economy, and then another chapter about political economy a few years later, and then keep it fancy chronologically, but keeping the same ideological perspective, it had chapters about race and religion and caste and class and how strategy was affected by cultural ideas of space, all kinds of things that seemed very odd to most people in my field at the time. When the book came out, I think it was of interest to a few historians in my field, the older ones, really didn't like it at all. And then I think most people were either perplexed or apathetic, just couldn't figure it out. Now, there was one aspect of my research in particular that intrigued me and stayed with me. I didn't pursue it much in that book about US-India relations. It had to do with frequent comments made by British visitors to India in the late 19th and early to mid 20th centuries concerning the strong smells they encountered there. India smelled different to British visitors. Some of the smells they registered as pleasant. They liked the smell of cooking fires at dusk. They liked coconut oil, as long as it wasn't applied too heavily. They loved the smell of flowers of Indian gardens, and especially the smell of jasmine. Other smells, however, the smell of curry in Indian cooking, the smell of animals on the street, the smell of excrement, animal and human, the smell of death, of corpses left too long in the sun or burning on ghats, the British found revolting, disgusting. The repulsive smells seemed more pervasive and more powerful to the British. They talked about them more. They lingered over them more. That was their impression. Long after my book was published, I couldn't stop thinking about smell as a factor in encounter between peoples. Encounter, in this case, between the British and their inheritors of empire, the Americans. Smell and difference. Over time, this rather small part of my thinking expanded into a larger interest in the role played by all 5 human senses: seeing, hearing, touching and feeling, smelling, tasting, in human encounters across borders, and sense perceptions formed and acted upon. Coupled with my growing curiosity about comparative empire, it grew into another book project. This was Empires of the Senses, which came out in 2019. The empires in question, as you can tell, India, British India, and the US Philippines. This book took, again, a broadly cultural approach to its subject. It examined not only official sensory impressions of Indians and Filipinos, but those of travelers and teachers and missionaries. My premise, again, was that foreign relations were not just found in diplomatic correspondence, but in day-to-day, body-to-body, nose-to-nose encounters between the agents and the subjects of empire. Here was life transacted on the ordinary ground of empire. There, everyone's sense organs were engaged in the application of imperial rule and in the accommodation or resistance to it. For sense impressions obviously went both ways. We're not talking just about how the British and the Americans perceived their subalterns through their senses. We're talking about the other way around as well. What did the Indians think of the British in a sensory way? How did the Filipinos regard the Americans, their senses of sight and sound, and so forth? As I said, I was interested in all 5 senses in these imperial encounters, but recalling what had been said about smell in India, that sense remained for me a particular fascination, and it's the one I'm going to talk about today. Before I do that, sorry, a bit more academic throat clearing. I'm going to offer 4 propositions. I almost call them axioms, but they're not quite that rigid. 4 propositions concerning sensory history. These emerged more or less organically as I did my research, and I hope to provide a useful context for considering the role of odor in Imperial India and the Philippines. So, proposition number 1. This is easy, I think, and that is that the senses have a basis in science. Chemical and biological impulses inspire our senses. Our cells register sensory inputs. Our sense organs, for example, our taste buds, receive impressions. Our nerves, for example, our optic nerve, convey these impressions to the brain, which processes and interprets them. As for smell, common cases, smell has a chemical form. Odor-producing molecules arrive with the intake of breath. on the nerve endings of our nostrils. So when you draw air in, you perceive smell. Smell comes in the form of these molecules. The information the molecules convey is carried instantly to sites in the brain related, as it happens, to memory and emotion. Nostalgia, for instance. So that's how the chemistry works. That's in a very rough way. I'm sure someone could give me a better breakdown of it. But that's how it happens. Molecules into the nose, the nerve endings carried to the brain processes and interprets what is being smelled. But the science of sensory input and uptake cannot tell us what the senses mean. So proposition number 2, how the sensory inputs received and understood changes over time, that is, talking about history, and differs according to place. That is, people from different places assign different values and meanings to their senses and what they mean. How the senses are ranked according to their importance depends on who you're asking and when. So let's take an example. Medical practice before X-rays, the 19th century. Before, in other words, practitioners could see what was going on inside the human body, at least in some ways. X-rays, as we know, are limited. We have now more sophisticated ways to look inside the body, but let's just use X-rays as an example. But before X-rays existed, other senses were more useful for treating patients. Seeing wasn't that helpful. Hearing was better. Talking to the patient, listening to what she said about her symptoms. Touching was important too, in finding out exactly where it hurt. And smelling was very important in understanding illness. Many doctors claimed that they could smell a particular illness on the breath, on which more later. All of these things were valued over seeing. So that's the second proposition, that the ranking of the senses, their importance, changed over time and according to place. Proposition 3. The senses trigger bodily reactions, and especially emotional ones. The senses trigger emotional responses. Think, for example, of how you feel when you hear a musical passage that's associated with a loved one who has passed away. There's little, I think, that can make you sadder than suddenly catching a snatch of music that was important or meaningful to someone you loved who's no longer with you. The only possible rival may be a smell that suddenly brings you back to how that person smelled. Something as mundane as perfume or the kind of detergent that person used on their clothing. But that's what I have in mind, the senses triggering profound bodily reactions. Or think of the nostalgia summoned by taste. That works too. Marcel Proust bit into a cookie called a Madeleine, and then he wrote 500 pages. And so much came flooding back to him as a result of this taste of the Madeleine. Or think of the disgust called forth by the touch of something unexpectedly sticky or slimy. Now, that may be something that's particular to certain people or certain cultures. Maybe others aren't bothered by it, maybe a little surprised. But that always gets me. When I go to touch something and I find that it's slimy and I didn't expect it to be slimy, I recoil. I feel disgust. So this, again, is what I have in mind about the senses triggering profound feeling. Finally, proposition 4, this is most important. How we rank the senses and how we respect or devalue them affect our assessments of how refined or civilized we believe others to be. With the advent of the European Enlightenment in the 17th and 18th centuries, the ranking of the senses in the West shifted, in part because of growing literacy. Seeing was elevated. Sight now became the preeminent sense. Hearing dropped below seeing. Previously, hearing was all important because it was an oral culture. What you said and what you heard mattered more. But with the increase of the production of text and the ability of people to understand text, seeing became more important. The other three senses, touch, taste, and smell, known as the close senses, were now derogated, relegated, associated increasingly with animals or with allegedly inferior human beings, who are now ranked by a new category of classification, the false and damaging category of race. Thus, how the senses were valued and how they were stimulated created impressions of selves and others. Now, what has any of this to do with the history of empire? I've moved on beyond the propositions. Let's talk about empire and the senses. Empire was once more, in part, an embodied experience. People in imperial spaces not only thought about each other, they met each other face to face, hand to hand, body to body. They formed, through their senses, impressions of each other. And on their basis, they developed feelings about them and classified them. Their reactions were visceral and emotional. People felt wonder at the seemingly different, but they also felt fear of bodily penetration, of violation, of pollution, of infection. Britons and Indians, Americans and Filipinos encountered each other through all five of their senses. So, Britons and Americans gazed at their subjects and cataloged them by taking photographs of them. Indians and Filipinos, for their part, hoped to fool or confound Western eyes, hiding or deceiving with looks of feigned obedience or innocence. Imperial agents regarded their subjects, I'm going down the list of the senses now. Imperial agents regarded their subjects as noisy, with their discordant brass bands, their shouting, their spitting, the keening of mourners, the babble of languages they struggled to understand. Yet, it was the tone of British and American voices that, to the Indians and Filipinos, was unmistakably harsh and haughty. They heard something else. They heard the sound of arrogance, the sound of imperial entitlement in the voices, in the soundscapes of empire. Westerners feared the touch of their subjects, with their skins so allegedly coarse that they seemed impervious to feeling, and with whom contact threatened to spread disease. Though the Indians and Filipinos also resisted the touch of foreigners, which they felt could be polluting or disabling. Think, for example, of early public health campaigns in both India and the Philippines, where Westerners essentially experimented on their subjects, giving them inoculations or vaccinations that were not yet fully tested in the metropoles. Accounts of some of these inoculation campaigns are quite harrowing. You could well imagine how imperial subjects would avoid or resist physical contact, touch with the imperialists. What foods their subjects or masters ate, appalling in their taste, and how disgustingly they ate them. So the British said, look at Indians who ate a kind of mush of rice and lentils with their hands. Look at the Filipinos, said the Americans, who ate every part of the pig, from snout to tail. How disgusting it was. Look, said the Indians and the Filipinos, at Britons and Americans who drank beer, which they thought was urine. And look at the British and Americans who ate not fresh meat, because they were frightened of it, but meat from a can. So the disgust ran both ways. And inevitably, there were the smells, always the smells, and the mutual perceptions of them. In India, according to the British, I'll just give you some sense of what they said they smelled. Quoting, the smell of fresh blood pouring down the streets of Delhi, the sweetish odor of human flesh decayed. In Sindh, and, quote, ammoniac odor, which more or less grips you by the throat. In Goa, the odor of drying fish. The reek of ubiquitous Hindu temple wells, a stench, one wrote, pervades the place with an intensity not to be described. To the Indian nose, though, it was the British who smelled bad. Their heavy clothes saturated with sweat. The British were such fools in what they wore. Naturally, those clothes, in a very short period of time, were going to reek. The, quote, evil-smelling, putrescent things the British ate, the rotten cheeses, I'm still quoting, the rotten cheeses, the game which they hung up, their chronically unbathed bodies. The British were infamous for that. There was a story told by a British writer about a British army doctor who instructed his Indian servant each Sunday to enter the doctor's church and tell him audibly in front of the other congregants that he, the doctor, had, quote, an urgent case to attend to. In this way, raising the status of the doctor, because only a high status person would have an urgent case, and also giving him an excuse to get out before the sermon. One evening, the doctor agreed to attend a meeting of Indians in town. It was a hot night, and the doctor was soon overwhelmed by the smell. He ran from the room, took several deep breaths, and then said, "Oh, what a relief to get out. In another 10 minutes, I should have collapsed. The smell." To which his servant replied, "Ah, Sahib, now you will understand what I suffer every Sunday when I have to go to the middle of the church to call you out." Americans in the Philippines complained about what they called the Filipino smell, as if there was one. All the Filipinos smelled alike, consisting variously of too much coconut oil, of rancid tobacco smoke, of open sewers, and corpses left too long exposed. Filipinos, for their part, objected to what they called the beefy odor of Americans, the sweat of Americans who ate too much beef, had a particular foul odor as far as the Filipinos were concerned. To the chemicals, especially carbolic acid, that the Americans used to disinfect all their surfaces. And like the Indians, to the unbathed bodies of their imperial masters. Now, I suppose you could argue that none of this mattered much. It's kind of interesting, it's kind of fun in a lurid way, material. Maybe this is just a matter of aesthetics. That's all sense impressions really add up to. There were certainly other features of empire that were deeper and more damaging. So the violence with which empire was bought and maintained, the racism that supported it, the economic exploitation that sustained it, the political domination that made it so insufferable to its victims. But I see it differently. The sense of smell, like the other senses, was heavily implicated in nearly every aspect of empire, including all of the things I just mentioned. Both the British and the Americans saw themselves as civilizers of what they judged to be backward societies, and they believed that a vital part of the civilizing process was to put the senses in the right order of priority and to protect them against offense or affront. Those lacking respect for the senses lacked self-control, allegedly. They were uncivilized and thus unfit for self-government. Societies that looked shabby, were noisy and smelly, felt wrong and consumed unwholesome foods in unmannerly ways, were not prepared to form independent polities and stand on their own. It was the duty of allegedly more sensorially advanced Westerners to put the senses right before withdrawing the most obvious manifestations of their power. Now, how in particular did this apply to smell in India and the Philippines? Among the senses, odor was, in the late 19th century, considered the strongest indicator of illness, of disease. Bad smells brought disease, which was potentially fatal if drawn through the nose into the lungs and the bloodstream. In other words, it was believed that bad smells could kill you. Diseases had particular odors. Tuberculosis was said to smell like stale beer. Yellow fever, butchered meat. The breath of diabetics, like acetone. And if you think this is silly, consider that there are disease-sniffing dogs who today do a pretty good job of detecting some kinds of cancer and COVID-19. Stink and illness were, it was believed, carried together on poisonous emanations from the earth and water that were called miasmas. The miasma theory of disease, the belief that is that the odors themselves carried on the emanations caused illness, persisted in Europe and the United States into the 20th century. Now that surprises some people because the germ theory, that is the understanding that bacteria actually were the agent of illness, had been uncovered as early as the 1860s, 70s in England and in France. But oddly, the germ theory really did not take hold until, at least evenly, until the early 20th century. And significantly, these odorous miasmas, these emanations, were said to exist with far greater frequency and harmfulness in so-called uncivilized places, and associated with those who lived in those places. Indeed, as a result of their proximity to the dangerous air of their soil and streams, imperial subjects, the people of Africa and Asia, were said to become sources of infection. Their miasmas and their bodily odors, carriers of diseases that threatened the penetrable bodies of the lighter complexioned men who ruled them. In this way was smell toxified and racialized. Now, smell was not just racialized. Some of you will know, probably all of you know, something of the history of Victorian Britain and the progressive United States. So Victorian Britain, let's say, roughly mid-century Britain to a bit later, progressive United States, late 19th century America, the early 20th century. During those periods of time, among other things, there were campaigns against bad smells that started in the metropoles, that is, in Britain and the United States. And they were aimed not so much at racial minorities, or not exclusively at racial minorities. They were aimed at the lower classes. That is what we were taught, that the lower classes smell, wrote George Orwell in The Road to Wigan Pier. Reformers walked London's slums, recording their terrible smells. The most abominable stenches, wrote one, giving rise to fever in the neighborhood. The stench gave rise to the fever. In the United States, Jacob Riis, a Swiss immigrant, wrote the progressive classic How the Other Half Lives, about the lives of recent immigrants living in New York City. Although that book is rightly remembered for its photographs of poverty, the book is most graphic concerning the smell. The odor, wrote Riis, of boiling cabbage, of rags, and uncleanliness all about. The worst source of both stench and disease, and thus the biggest target of city sanitationists, was human waste, especially excrement. Excrement, human feces, was matter out of place. It was an attack on hygiene, order, civilization. In response to the filth in their cities, British and American urban planners built underground sewers, directing excrement underground, away from nostrils. Such efforts were duly exported to the colonies, and here's where India and Philippines re-enter the story. In India and the Philippines, the agents of empire insisted, the problems of waste removal were even more difficult than in the metropoles. The issue, they said, was the indifference of their subjects toward waste. The odor of excrement apparently didn't bother them. It was just one more smell. They had no sense of hygiene, no sense of shame about defecating everywhere. Efforts to persuade people to use latrines struggled to gain traction. To an extent, thought the British and Americans, this indicated the inherent inferiority of their subject. Stench clung to both the bodies and the attitudes of the dark people, the racialized others of empire, but only to an extent. Instead, the Westerners viewed the tolerance for foul smells as a feature of civilizational backwardness rather than of race. It was, in other words, not inherent, at least not in Indians and Filipinos. Rather, the agents of empire thought, subjects could be taught about the unpleasantness and dangers of bad odors and could be persuaded to suppress them. Hence, the vigorous sewer and latrine building campaigns in the colonies and strenuous efforts to teach Indians and Filipinos to use them. Did the campaigns against odor work? On the whole, sort of, modestly. Things were better in the cities and the empires than in the countryside. Problems were resources mostly. Hooking up individual households to sewer systems that were built proved to be surprisingly hard to do. Getting enough water to flush the system wasn't always easy. The sewer systems, in other words, remained works in progress. There were many reasons why the United States and Britain granted independence to their colonies. There were new post-war constraints. After 1945, imperial power was necessarily reduced. Most important, determined nationalism in both places, in India and the Philippines, pushed the British and Americans to give up their control. And it's worth noting, parenthetically, that the Western nations retained a strong presence in their former colonies. The British presence in India was largely cultural and linguistic. The US's economic and strategic in the Philippines, as many of you probably know. The Americans retained military bases in the Philippines for a very long time. But Britons and Americans could also tell themselves that they had moved their subjects along the path toward their version of sensory civilization. Elites in both places wore versions of Western clothes, so they looked right, they looked more civilized. Elites in both places largely spoke English, making them more comprehensible. They sounded right. Diseases spread by bodily contact, by touch, had declined in frequency and lethality. Touch. In India, taste actually went the other way. It was the Britons who were fully won over to the joys of Indian food. If you're looking at kind of very crude terms, who had more civilized food? It was clearly the Indians over the British. And the British indeed loved Indian food, or came to love Indian food, to the point where when Britons went home, following the ending of empire, they often brought Indian cooks with them to serve them in their homes. And Indian restaurants grew up around London, and they were beloved by the British. That was far less true, by the way, of the Philippines. One is hard-pressed to find many Filipino restaurants in major American cities. And if the smells that had so offended Western noses had not been eliminated, they had at least been reduced. Insofar as agents of empire like to tell themselves stories of their virtue and their success in civilizing others, here was one more story to treasure. They had taught their subjects olfactory manners. Thank you for your patience. I'll stop.
Thank you, Andrew. The floor is now open for Q&A. If you have any comments, any questions, please ask him. Please be brief and raise your hands. Also, you can also ask your question in Nepali. People will translate it for you, and
Sure.
we will answer in English.
That was a lot. But I apologize.
Let me ask you the first question.
Please.
You said you went to India and then looked at the archives, and then came to this, cultural thing. But how did you come to do this research, or particularly it is through the archives, it is through the dispatches, memoirs, or whatever? What led you to do this kind of research?
Well, yeah, what led me to do it was, again, the idea that this was a project, that is the project of figuring out how U.S. foreign relations work. That was as much, roughly speaking, anthropological or cultural as it was text-bound, a kind of crude field work that other historians were starting to do timidly, that is, adopting some of the methods of anthropologists, made sense to me and appealed to me. Now, there's another question embedded there, and that is, how does one go about doing actual research on the senses? Where does one find information about that? How does one interpret encounters, random encounters that I described with the people next door or the people in the field in Tamil Nadu? And that's a trick, and that's why it took me a while to write this book. If you go to an archive or a library or even a collection of relevant papers, you don't find these materials organized according to the senses. My dream was, a crazy dream, was to go into an archive and find like files labeled smell. But of course you weren't going to find anything like that. So you had to think imaginatively about what would convey the sense. Seeing was fairly easy, since that's what we default to when we do our research. It's about looking, it's about reading, it's about text. But it's also about looking at images, at photographs, and I found that especially interesting. The extent to which Britons in India and Americans in the Philippines resolutely went about trying to keep records of everyone, taking photographs again and again, or having pictures drawn before photographs were possible, of everyone who came into a police station, for example, or everyone who brought in a tax payment. There's just voluminous files of photographs of ordinary people. The idea is you have to see a people in order to know them, and you have to know them in order to control them. So that was seeing. Hearing, I was able to find some interesting files in the British Library in particular about the use of brass bands. Now, brass bands had existed in India for a very long time, and the British were fascinated by them. But they also, as I mentioned in the course of my talk, found them extremely annoying because they couldn't be controlled. They would suddenly appear, the British couldn't fathom quite why they were there. They were very loud, and at times when the British wished to work, what little work they did, or sleep, the brass bands were disruptive. I also found records having to do with education. Education was a huge priority for both Britons and Americans. They wanted to teach English to a segment of elite members of both places. And one of the things they complained about most when they created schools was the unruliness of their subjects. They made noise. They were undisciplined. It was hard to get them to settle down. If you can imagine, I imagine anyone who's ever taught a classroom full of young children has the sense that you just have to get them to quiet down first. Well, this is how the paternalistic agents of empire viewed their charges in school. These people needed to respect order. And the other thing, of course, about educating people was to teach them a language that you could understand. This too has to do with control. You can't control them if you can't understand them. If they're speaking in a language you can't or won't learn, and this was almost universally true of the Americans who couldn't speak Filipino, some spoke Spanish, but most didn't bother to learn. In India, it was a little different. British Foreign Service officers had to learn an Indian language. It wasn't always the right one, but they did. But it so frustrated them that they could not know what their subjects were up to. So they wanted to teach them English. So controlling the soundscape, the auditory ecosystem, sorry, kind of a grand term, of a colony was a high priority for them. What to do about taste? Cookbooks? I've read a bunch of cookbooks. And there are lots of memoirs, very, very useful are memoirs in doing this kind of work, where people talk about what they ate, what they made to eat, or what was available at the market, or how things were when they were invited to a big party at the house of some Indian prince, and what were all these dishes, and how were they all eaten. Observations of both admiration and disgust. And I'll add, by the way, that the best memoirs, the most information about this kind of social history came from women. I was only happiest when I found a memoir written by a woman because she tended to record this kind of information. Men in the 19th and early 20th centuries, I think, felt themselves constrained, that they couldn't talk about that. It wasn't somehow serious enough to talk about the food you ate, so they just talked about high business. But women's memoirs were very helpful in this way. What are we up to? Oh, touch. So I made some brief reference to this, but public health campaigns really raised lots of concerns about bodily contact. Do you allow some white doctor to come in with a soothing voice and a bunch of helpers, often hired from the local population, to give your child an inoculation? Now, when I say inoculation, you'll think of a syringe rather quickly and almost painlessly, putting something into your muscle. That's not how it was done in the 20th century. The skin had to be opened with a sharp knife, and then the material had to be pushed into the open skin, and the skin kind of rubbed until it closed up, or if it closed up. You can imagine a parent seeing this kind of thing happen to their child and saying, I don't want those people to touch me. And something else, and this goes into the issue of gender, which I didn't talk about directly, but figures into this quite a bit. British male doctors in India examining women who were pregnant. American male doctors in the Philippines examining women who came in with some kind of physical complaint. It was appalling to think about. And so that kind of touch in particular was resisted often. by victims. So if I can find files about public health, then I can find out things about touch. I also, by the way, wrote in that chapter about not just touch, but feel. So touch is an active thing. You reach out, you touch somebody. But there's also the sense of feeling things through your skin. We call this hapticity, touch and feel together. There were so many comments about the feel of the environment in India, the feel of the environment in the Philippines, the tropics. It was hot, it was wet. Western European, American bodies were not used to this kind of intensity. And they wrote about it a lot. It was debilitating. It gave them sores, it made them ill. My asthmas, again, were really part of this sense of touch, of feel. And then finally, smell, which I talked about at length. Where do you find out information about smell? Again, public health, especially public sanitation campaigns. This is what prompted so many efforts in the colonies to create sewers, to pave roads, to prevent these noxious, poisonous gases from coming up out of the ground and making all the poor Westerners die. They really believed that what came out of the ground would kill them. Now, in fact, if there were bacteria in these emanations, if there was something in the water that you drank, it could kill you. It wasn't the smell itself. So again, I was able to find files having to do with that, and that's how I did the work.
Yeah.
Kind of a methodological question. I mean, at the beginning of your talk, you said not many within your subfield have opted for the kind of methods that you have.
Yeah.
And I was wondering then how, through the method that you opted, what kind of story have you been, or people who have followed your sort of, or joined your bandwagon, have been able to tell the story of American foreign policy, the history of American foreign policy, through the methodology that you sort of opted for?
Yeah. Bless your heart for saying I have a bandwagon. I have maybe 3 people who think this is a good idea. No, it's more than that. So I glossed over this a bit, and I think you picked this up, that there were really a couple of turns here. One was a broadly cultural turn where we began paying attention to cultural and social history. So that first book about India, which considered such things as gender and race and religion, constructed categories, I would argue cultural categories. I think that made a certain amount of sense to some people. There was active resistance to it. I wasn't alone by any means in doing this. Other people had already written about gender in particular, and about race a lot. Religion was kind of new, and I think probably prompted by having chosen India, where you just cannot write about relations between nations without thinking about religion. Yeah, that was part of a kind of minor wave within the larger field, but I think still remained devoted to the older methods. And yet there was also a sense, and this is organizational history that you may or may not be interested in, that the field that used to be known as diplomatic history, what I call US foreign relations, had grown pretty stale methodologically, that it hadn't done anything new in a long time, and as a result it was being left behind in the discipline. There were fewer and fewer people being trained in it. There was less and less interest in reading it. Everyone was a culturalist or a social historian. Intellectual history lagged a bit too, but the traditional older forms of doing history, the kind of stuff done by wealthy old men in their libraries, was no longer so popular after the 1960s. So I think some viewed this as a way of refreshing the field, even if they weren't entirely sure it was sound. They thought, well, maybe it's a good idea to at least pretend we've joined the 21st century, or then, more like the 19th. There was that. Now, the census book garnered even less support. There were some people we were talking about this the other day, there are pinpoints around the world where people are interested in the history of the senses, mostly again with regard to cultural or social history. The Dutch are really into this. The Canadians, I have friends in Canada who think this is great stuff. And then in Southeast Asia, I had contacts from several people in Southeast Asia who were working on usually one sense, which is a good idea. To try and do all 5 senses if you're a doctoral candidate is unwise. So there's a woman who worked on noise in Hong Kong, for example, really, really interesting. And she read my work, and then 2 years later she wrote something that was for a master's thesis that was more sophisticated than what I had done. So that was really encouraging. It's pretty limited though. And I was pretty safe. In my field, I had a job. They weren't going to fire me. It's the beauty of tenure in the United States. They can't really fire you unless you do something terrible. And so I could play in ways that not everyone could. So even if people regarded this as a little bit unseemly, this work on the senses, what were they going to say? I had a reputation and I had a good job. Thanks for the question. It was a great question.
There.
Oh,
Please, yours.
Oh, yes. So you've made a case for using the discipline of history to study the 5 human senses. And I know that your background is more focused on, obviously, imperial histories and U.S. foreign relations. But I'm curious to know, I guess I'm curious if migration or diaspora have been topics that you've thought about in your work thus far, especially coming from an Asian American studies background myself.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, I'm asking that question. I think it's interesting that you come here today with an expertise on Indian imperial subjects and actors and Filipino imperial subjects and actors. And I think it's also interesting because a lot of Nepali people, as we increasingly move into diaspora and migrate outside of Nepal, I think we're oftentimes racialized alongside, whether it's in like the Persian Gulf, for example, or in other global south contexts, where we're working alongside Indian workers or Filipino workers, we're oftentimes racialized in one of those ways, or even in the global north. I think that's a common racialization, is we're either seen as being Indian or Filipino. So I think this research is honestly also applicable to the Nepali diaspora. So I guess I'm interested in thinking about, I guess, just how, also knowing that in Filipino American studies and Indian American studies, the topic of race or racial difference is often domesticated into just kind of like racial stereotypes or racial bias, and that is not able to capture racial violence or global hegemony. So that's, I know there's a lot in that question, but I guess I'm curious to know if, based on anything I just said, if anything resonates, or if I guess how you're thinking about migration and diaspora and looking at the, especially smell in diaspora.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. My first thought is to say that of the senses that come to mind when you ask your question, it's about visibility, isn't it? It's about seeing, and I think the Nepalis are just unseen. That I don't think they figure in thinking about who could be part of a laboring population or a diasporic population. Americans and Britons are stunningly ignorant of other people in other places. And what confuses them causes them, I think, to put people into categories, broad categories that they understand at least a little bit better. I'm not sure that most white Americans fully grasp differences in any South Asians, differences between Indians and Pakistanis, which is a bizarre thing to imagine. But if they can get their eyes around it, eyes on it at all, here is a big category of people to whom certain cliches apply, And in the United States now anyway, and I think this is true to a large extent in the UK as well, South Asians are part of a model minority. With all the gracelessness of those stereotypes, nevertheless, I think they probably exist. Kind of talking around it. But let me speak more directly to the matter of migration, especially diasporic history. There is a lot of literature on the senses in that field. I was quite willing to dip into it without fully engaging with the methodologies of the field. It's something that I consider to be like history, but not quite like history. I didn't want to presume to be or become an expert in diasporic history. But yeah, as you say, there's a lot of good material in, say, Asian American history, Asian American studies, about the kind of tormented sociologies of coming to a new place. A lot of stuff about smell and taste. And of course, they're connected, as we know. You don't really taste something without smelling it. There are a lot of people working on the Filipino diaspora. And I read several accounts by Filipinos who said their greatest fear was of someone smelling what they were cooking and kind of relegating them to the place where many Indians have been relegated, that curry smell. You probably know there's a kind of running sick joke in the United States about how you hope you don't move into an apartment that Indians have lived in because you'll never get rid of the smell of curry. And there was an awful lot of that. And I was able to use it. Now, I was talking about empire. I was talking about this being mostly in India and mostly in the Philippines. So I was less directly interested in what was going on in New York City or what might be going on in Chicago. But as you say, there's a lot of interest and high sensitivity to this. Something else I was going to say about diasporic, these kind of sociologies of arrival. I know. This may be off topic, but if you're in the United States for the really awful presidential campaign, and then the awful result of the presidential campaign, you may remember a lot of comments from the Republican campaign about the smell of Kamala Harris's environment, about her plane at one point. One of Trump's spokespeople said, "Oh, we don't want to go near that plane because it'll smell of her kitchen, it'll smell of curry." So that stereotype was wielded by the other side, and by the Trump campaign. Interestingly, the person who said that was a guy named Stephen Chung, Trump's spokesman, whose parents owned a Chinese restaurant outside Sacramento. And I think there's almost no question that they would have been subject to the same kind of bias. Yeah, that the Chung family is smelling things up.
And just to get a better historiographical picture, so did the literature on the senses within the diaspora, did that come, I guess, before or after your work?
Yeah, I don't know that the senses themselves have developed as a particular field within diasporic studies. I think there are people interested in it. And because I was able to draw on some of that literature, I guess I would say before. On the other hand, I started thinking about this a long time ago. If I may defend myself as an early adopter of sensory history, just because the book only came out 5 years ago doesn't mean I haven't been thinking about this for a very long time. So I don't know who was first. I was hardly the first in. I was hardly the revolutionary. The French have been doing sensory history for a very long time. A guy named Alain Corbin, Foucault cared about this stuff, lot of it is in literature as well. Oh, and then there's a wonderful historian in the United States named Mark Smith, who I've followed. He doesn't write about empire or foreign policy, he writes about race. And he was someone who taught me that race could not be figured in just one sense. It was more than just visual, the way people created race. It was also about how race sounds, how race smells, how race feels. He's very persuasive, and he's a very good historian.
Shiraji.
I wanted to come back to your presentation, which you kept talking about the British and the Americans did this, the Westerners did this. So you put them both in one basket, and I wondered, were they swapping notes? Why were they having the same trajectory in the things that they did? I mean, clearly there are differences, as you pointed out, but there seems to be a similarity in the way that they viewed all of this. How did this come to be?
Yep, you got me. Well, the comparison came to be because I thought just doing one would be a little provincial. I wanted to do a comparison. I was interested in similarities and differences between the two experiments. I was also terrified that I hadn't been able to carry it off. It asked a lot of me. I'm not asking for sympathy here, but I knew something about US foreign relations. I've written quite a bit about it. I knew a little about India too, because I'd written this book on US-India relations, and I tried as much as possible to work from the Indian side as well. I worked in Indian sources, English language Indian sources. But I did not know that much about the Philippines, very little in fact. And my understanding of the British Empire was limited to, a handful of books that I had read over the years and even taught. So it was a bit audacious for me to do this. But it was really about this kind of de-provincializing what had become kind of hermetically sealed narratives of a single empire at a time. I thought empires ought to be compared intrinsically. Even if you found they were very different, it was still worth doing that. Trading notes is exactly what they did. In fact, even though these empires were not exactly in sync, so the British Empire specifically comes to India in 1858 following the rebellion, and the Americans don't annex the Philippines for another 40 years. Still, at that time, it was remarkable to me how often British diplomats would write to their American counterparts and say, congratulations, we need you here in Asia. We're very glad you joined the party. We never really understood this seeming resistance you had to formal empire. We don't want to compete with you, so we're very happy you've got your sphere over there. Please be content with that. We'll take care of India, you take care of the Philippines, and we'll do most of the rest in between. You stay there. But there was a sense on both sides of Anglo-Saxon mission, that this was something that Anglo-Saxon nations did. And sure enough, this is a period really just before the First World War, it lasts about that long, of remarkable harmony in US-UK relations. I think we tend to assume that it was always good between the two sides. It wasn't always good. There was great tension. I mean, after all, the United States broke away from Britain. And weirdly, throughout the 19th century, British memories of that stayed fairly fresh. So this was a moment of coming together. We're doing this as racially selected people who agree with each other on the importance of civilizing other men and women. And so that was of interest to me, and to me it justified the comparison. They also exchanged a lot of notes on things like public health. So there were a number of diseases that were common to both places, and they would experiment. What worked for you? Oh, we tried this. So leprosy. I got like so deep into leprosy, it was sick. And I brought it home sometimes. Just I learned something interesting about leprosy today. And no one at the table wanted to hear it. So that they couldn't solve leprosy. And they found leprosy so debilitating, so hideous. Their first impulse was to isolate lepers, which had been done forever. The Americans built a leper colony off the Philippine mainland called at Culion Island. and moved every leper they could find from the Philippines into this colony. This is a history that needs to be written. A guy named Warwick Anderson has written some about it. I wrote a little bit about it in this book. Someone really needs to write about Culion Island. There are photographs of it, and apparently there was a library, and it's just like full of old documents just sitting there unfiled, moldering away, but some brave young person ought to go and do it. So the Americans isolate their lepers. The British try to do that and then find it's just impossible because the lepers won't stay isolated. They go back to their families. And so the British kind of pull back, and they tend to, as they often do in empire, leave this to the states or even to cities, municipalities. Do what you want with your lepers. Whatever you feel comfortable doing, that's okay with us. So there's some cases of isolating lepers. There's some of tolerating lepers. It's a much more variegated policy than you find in the Philippines, where all the lepers are really taken off for this Foucauldian hell on Culion Island. So all those things were of interest to me. Now, whether they add up to the vital need to have done a comparison, I don't know. I guess you'd have to read the book and decide for yourself.
No, it wasn't a question of your methodology. I wanted to know how they were swapping notes.
Ah,
You know, how were
okay.
they on the same course?
Yeah.
There's nothing.
No, you found my own insecurity about it.
Nothing on that.
Yes.
Isn't there also a literature on the incredible directness with which Americans eagerly adopted British attitudes towards South Asians, East Asians, that there was a more than readiness to learn those dominating attitudes and those techniques for feeling superior?
Yes, there absolutely was. It was tempered a bit by the perception that the Americans were not going to play little brother to anybody, but they were especially deferential in India, and that's what I found in doing the India book. So much of these American attitudes were formed in the wake of British control, and when the British get out, when Pakistan becomes independent in 1947, suddenly there's a vacuum of power that the Americans at least are very worried about. What's going to happen to South Asia? The great game had been played in the 19th and 20th centuries. It was always the fear of the Russians somehow coming down and filling a vacuum. The British had fought that great game, and now they weren't there. The great game might continue if the Soviet Union was as aggressive and expansionist as many Americans feared. It's up to the United States to fill this vacuum. How do we do it? And you're right, they learned most of how to do it from the British. They asked them directly, what do we do here? And the British were inclined to be, helpful. They kind of liked the idea that the Americans were asking them for advice, but they were out. It was up to the Americans to figure out how to manage this. And we talked about that. The way the Americans manage it is pretty badly. They decide that you've got to find a stand-up player in South Asia in case the Russians come barreling down from the Caspian Sea, which they were not going to do. But the answer was not in constant India, with all these Hindus who couldn't quite decide what they were for or against, and all of these gods, so they had no sense of right and wrong. But the Pakistanis, who talked a very good game of good and evil, and were on your side. So the Pakistanis said to the Americans, give us lots of weapons and give us lots of aid, and we'll fight your battles for you, which they never intended to do. The Americans went along. Stand-up Muslims in Pakistan. We forget all this now because of the hostility to Muslims felt by many Americans who took the United States government. But in 1954, say, it was all about Pakistan because you couldn't trust India.
So one question.
Yeah.
During the course of your research, did you find any similarities between the Indian sub-races? Like in context, your research is based on American and British people coming to India, right? because India was a big nation with different races. Like, was there a hierarchy among the people, like with inferior or superior race?
Yeah.
Within themselves?
Yeah, the British did that quite deliberately, of course. The British created hierarchies.
What I meant was like,
Oh, sorry.
was there before the British came? When we find out, like, was there a hierarchy among, like, with reference to smell, like before the Britishers came to India, among the Indians, like with people from different religions, like they had different smell. The rituals, Hindus rituals are different than the ones with Islam, right?
Well,
So, what I mean is, like,
Yeah.
was there like distinction or like discrimination among people as well? Like,
Sure, there was. It's a question that makes me a little nervous, honestly, and in part because I just don't know enough about the pre-imperial history of India, and in part because I do think that a lot of these divisions were contrived divisions. Not that everything was happy and everything was harmonious, and that caste and community barriers didn't exist, because of course they did. But they were played upon, exacerbated by the British in order to rule more successfully. Now, yeah, how fine-grained can an analysis be of the so-called Indian perception of smell? I think some, and most of the information I found about the historical relationship between Indians and odor had to do with Hindu texts. That the Hindus, for example, declare certain smells to be bad smells, among them excrement. It was never the case that Indians enjoyed the smell of excrement or tolerated the smell of excrement. It was about resources, I think, and an ability to, technological ability to deal with this stuff. I'm trying to think of the timing here. So the British, the London sewers are finished in 1875. In 1858, there's a big stink in London, a literal great stink. There's a wafting off the Thames, and everyone thinks it's causing typhoid. And Parliament has to shut down because the stink is so bad. And this is what prompts the British to build sewers, 1858. And that's early. But they're done in 1875. And the Americans are kind of following along, bumbling along. It's a typical American story. Cities should do it for themselves. There's no federal policy on sewers. It's relatively late. So the idea that somehow Indians are tolerating smells, Indians are behind in this, it's just not borne out by the history. Sewer building is a late 19th, early 20th century phenomenon wherever it's done. And it's being done in the colonies at roughly the same time it's being done in the metropoles. I did find some information about certain Indian communities really valuing the sense of smell. So there's a community on the Andaman Islands called the Anji community. I don't know if you've heard of this, I hadn't. But they've been studied by anthropologists who've concluded that the Anji have a particular interest in the sense of smell. In part, they posit because senses of sight and hearing are often occluded. You can't see through forest. You can't hear through forest. So smell matters more. And there's all kinds of evidence about the language used by these people centering on smell and showing affection by sniffing the heads of their children. Others do that too in India, I should say, but the Anji are apparently famous for this. Because I love you, I will sniff your head is something apparently said there. So there are these little hints of what you're suggesting, but I want to be kind of careful about overstepping my modest expertise and say much about it.
Yeah, thank you. I found the presentation very fascinating in the sense that, like a very seemingly mundane thing like smell could have such a profound authority and effect on, differentiating between us and them. Yeah?
Thank you.
And now that we even have a very big global industry around trying to smell it, a big industry.
Yes.
So I guess like, I mean, you know, my question is partly a follow on of his question. Is you talk about these, you know, interactions between the imperial and the subjects, yeah? Imperial agents and the subjects, with smell as one of the, you know, indicators around which these relationships are occur. And as you were saying, like India, I don't know much about Philippines, but India is a very hierarchical society, you know, based around caste, and there's a lot of discourse about smell around caste. So you know, high castes smelling in differently than the so-called lower castes. So I mean, in the archives, in the conversations that you had, you know, you mostly focus on the imperial agents and the subjects. But to what extent was, you know, smell a topic of conversation and a topic of, you know, forming social relations within the imperial, within the subjects themselves? I mean, did that figure out in any of these? Any of the, you know, archives or other materials or other conversations that you had? And I mean, there would also be instances of good smell. So
Yeah.
I mean, smell was not always abhorrent. So, and to what extent the imperial agents try to patronize the good smells in a research?
Yeah, make those distinctions, right. That's a good question. It makes me think in this way. That I think there was there was an imperial project of civilization that was aimed at the elite groups, I would say the upper castes, aimed at Brahmins, with the expectation that Brahmins were more educated, more socially apt, better able to understand the need to maintain nonviolence, social stability. And in that way, I think British officials were willing to say, yeah, it's not these people so much who are creating the bad smells. These people can be made to understand about the importance of keeping the smell down. But there was another side of it, a populist side of it, I suppose, where people writing in their memoirs said the cleanest people in India were the lower classes and lower castes in India. Yes, they often had to do the filthiest kinds of tasks, but they were personally very clean. And in fact, the British, if they were being honest, and some of them were, again, women especially were, said things like, my servants are remarkably clean. I wish I could say the same thing for the British soldiers who are living out in the cantonment. It's just not so. And they'd say things like, they have to expose themselves, the Indians do, to all kinds of substances that are really awful, but they themselves bathe a great deal. This is remarkable to see how often they bathe and how important they think it is to be clean. So I think, and as you say, as I said, there were smells in India that were attractive to the British. The kind of rhapsodies that people would go into as they were making their way home in a carriage at dusk, and the lovely sweet scent of dung fires burning as the carriage made its way back, a kind of romance about India. So there was that as well. I don't mean to say it was all viewed with horror, and I think they were willing to agree, you know, whatever caste it was, that Indians could be made, as I said, could be made to respect the nose, could be made to respect the sense of smell, in part because they were already doing it. Not always, not often enough, not in some deep ways, but it could happen. Why else would you bother to build all those latrines and to spend all of that agony on sewers and complaining about the smells of Indian cities, unless you believe that something could and should be done? They must have believed that Indians agreed with them, that public excrement was not a good thing. And I think that was probably true of all castes. I think they viewed that as all Indians. Now, they were never, they thought, going to civilize the millions and millions of Indians. That was futile. But it didn't matter. if you aimed at a certain number of them, if you could convince them of the need to learn manners, basically, then perhaps that was enough. Or perhaps that was all you were going to get. Because the British could hear the clock ticking. I think a number of them, by the 1920s, I think they knew that this wasn't going to last forever. We've got kind of a Churchillian fetish that, you know, all the horrible things Churchill said about empire, where, you know, I did not become the king's first minister to preside over the demise of the British Empire. We think that's all of them, all the Britons. They knew better than that, at least some of them did. They knew they could not rule all these people forever. That's kind of a rambling response.
We usually close at 4:30. So we are about to, it's, 1 minute left. So if there is one question left, then we can take one. Okay, go ahead.
Is there anyone else who has a question? I already asked one, so, okay. Ooh, I don't know what question next. I guess, why history? I mean, I know you said like a lot of the people doing work on sensory related topics are ethnographers or, I don't know, I guess like I would assume folklorists and anthropologists, culturalists. So why do you choose to call yourself a historian and fit your work into that discipline?
Because I am a historian. Yeah, I firmly believe that historians ought to take the census seriously, and a lot of people, most people agree with me that bodies matter. You know, the census is a subset, I think, of history of the body or emotional history. There are lots of ways in which you can take this, but there are plenty of historians working in those areas. It's an awfully big tent history, and no one cares as deeply, and this is a tautology, about the past as historians do, and that's what I care about. That's what matters most to me. And for all of my flirtation, it's more than flirtation, with culture and anthropology, I really love the stuff, but I can't go off into the field and pretend that somehow I'm going to learn something about a community I've only read about, and that I can come in as now an old white guy and get that. I think even if you'd asked me, even if I had the kind of brain I have now, the interest I have now, if you'd asked me when I made this decision like 50 years ago, which way I wanted to go, I would still have said, I want to be a historian. I want to figure out what started all this stuff. What are the roots of all of this? And then, yeah, maybe later in life I'll branch out and dabble in anthropology.
Before we end, I have a footnote question. During your presentation, you said that the Indians and the Filipinos, you know, avoid the foul smell that was coming from the British and the Americans, right?
Okay.
They also avoid the smell.
Yes.
So is it, they thought that they did not bathe, right?
Who, the Indians and the Filipinos?
Yes.
Oh, they always bathe. They were
No.
much clearer.
They thought that the British and the Americans didn't, right?
Right.
Is it the perception or is it the reality?
No, that was the reality. That's really true. And it's funny to see, I don't want to turn this into a caricature. The Americans, some of the Americans and the Britons who came to these places were pretty open to being there. After all, they weren't all forced to go there. The Americans were, the soldiers went up. These empires were born in violence, and violence begets domination. But soon after, you've got to govern. And then your perceptions begin to change. And sure enough, both Britons and Americans came to realize that they were not bathing enough. Now, part of it was they could say, with some justice, we're from a different kind of climate. It isn't as important to bathe as often if we're living in a temperate climate, if we're living in the American Northeast, or if we're living anywhere in the UK. It's just not as hot. You don't have to look after yourself quite as much. But I think someone ought to do a paper on this, how bathing was how bathing in the United States was invented in the Philippines and Puerto Rico. Wouldn't quite be accurate, but I think that's true. So when did the first bathtub go to the White House? It's like the 1850s, I think. 1850s? Can you imagine?
Okay, thank you with that very notes.
On that, yeah.
I thank Andrew and every one of you. And there's discussion there the day after tomorrow. It's a democracy dialogue about Madhis movement. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your questions.